recording and put up the chats. And okay. So now you guys know how each of the pieces move. You guys know what the board is. You guys know what checkmate is and stalemate is and how much each piece is worth. And you also know what castling is. Or at least you should know that. If you don't, then one of the previous classes should teach you. But now we want to get into actually playing the game. So chess is divided into 3 sections, as I said before. Does anyone know what those 3 sections are? There's one for the beginning, one for the middle, and one for the end. Does anyone know what they're called?
The opening, the mid-game, and the end game?
Yeah, well done, wonderful. So far, I taught you guys the opening. So in the opening, I said, okay, just try and get these 6 pieces out. And you want to try and get them out towards the center of the board. That way they can move the most places. Then after you get those 6 pieces out, you want to castle. And you're not allowed to move the same piece twice unless you absolutely have to. And you shouldn't move a piece and then ever move it back because that would waste time. And you're not supposed to get your pieces in front of each other. So for example, when you get a piece here, that would be in front of this. Okay, so that's the opening. And the whole point of the opening is to get the strong pieces out. The stage right after that is the mid game. Now the mid game is the hardest one to explain to people because there isn't really a clear goal. Like in the opening, the clear goal is, okay, I want to get all my soldiers active. But the mid game is do whatever you can to win the game. That's essentially the mid game. Do whatever you can to get pieces. So since it's the hardest one to explain, I'm just going to skip over it for now, and then we'll come back to the mid game. The next easiest one for me to tell you guys about is the end game, which is the very end of the game. So in the end of the game, there's usually not many pieces left. You see, like right now, only pieces that are left is the 2 kings. Of course, the kings are always going to be on the board because if one of them is dead, then that person loses. And there's 1 pawn left. Now, let's say the pawn wasn't here. What would happen in this game? Could either side ever win? No. So what we call this is called a draw. In other words, you stop the game because there's no way to win. There's no way possibly for either side to win. So it's a draw. The same thing would go if there's even a knight here, because there's no way to checkmate with a knight. Just take it from me, it's impossible to checkmate with just a knight. So this is also a draw because there's no way you can ever checkmate him and there's no way he can ever checkmate you. So it's a draw. This, however, is not a draw. And there's a reason it's not a draw. Even though a pawn is worth less than a knight, if it gets to the end, something special happens. So when a pawn gets to the very end, it promotes. What that means is it can transform into either a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. It can transform into one of these. Actually, no, it's not a can, it has to. It has to transform into one of those 4 pieces. It can't choose to stay as a pawn. It can't transform into a king, and it also can't switch colors. So he transforms into one of these 4, but he can't switch colors or become a king or stay as a pawn. Does that make sense? That's called promotion. So as you can see, even though a pawn is worth less than a knight, it can make itself be worth more than a knight if it gets to the end. Because when it gets to the end, it can become a queen, and a queen is worth way more than a knight. And with a queen, you can actually checkmate your opponent. It's possible. For example, if you get to this situation, this is checkmate, right? So it's possible to win with a pawn, but it's not possible to win with just a knight and a king. It's just not possible. Okay, Now, so these end games are called king and pawn end games because the only things that are on the board are the kings and the pawns. And the whole point of king and pawn end games is for the person with the pawn. So right now, white has the pawn. The person with the pawn is just trying to get the pawn to the end. And the person without the pawn is just trying to stop that pawn. Okay. So let's say it's like this. Okay. This pawn can just move up, and no matter how fast black king moves, he won't ever catch up to the pawn because you see he made it in time and now he's a queen. So in that situation, the black king was too far away to ever catch the pawn. Okay. What about here? Do you think the black king can catch the pawn in this situation? No, he's far too far away. Even if he gets the first move, he moves and he's about to, and the pawn, boom. You see, he didn't make it. Now, it's easy to say in these situations, but it's a little harder to say, for example, in this situation. Do you think he'll make it in this situation? It's hard, isn't it? So here's how we do it. Here's how you do it really quickly. So first you have to figure out whose turn it is. Let's say it's black's turn, okay? If it's black's turn, we have to imagine that there's this magical square here. So the way we figure out how big the square is look, the pawn has 4 squares to get to the end. So the square side is 5 lengths. So you see this square here? If the king can go into that square, he'll catch the pawn. It'll be okay. So like if he goes here, he'll catch the pawn. Look, he will catch the pawn. See, he caught him. He caught him in time. But if the king is too far away and he can't go into that square, so right now you see the king cannot go into that square. He can only go to one of these squares, and that's not inside the square. He won't be able to catch the pawn in this situation. Because let me just show you, he's going there, and look, he didn't catch him, right? And that's how you figure out if the king will ever catch the pawn or not. So that's like that. So just as an exercise, will the king catch the pawn here? Yeah, so you can just create this square. And you see that the king will catch the pawn. Okay, what about here? Will the king catch the pawn here? Actually, let me say this position there. Will the king catch the pawn here? Well, let me just draw the square and it'll be easier for you to see. Can the king catch the pawn? Yeah, he can go into that square. Now, the only time that this is not true, the only time is if the pawn is at the very beginning. If the pawn is at the very beginning, he can do something special. He can actually move 2 times on his very first move. If that's the case, then it's almost like the pawn is here. So you want to imagine that the square is a little bit smaller than it is. So it wouldn't actually be this big. The square would actually be this big. Yeah, like that. If he's on the second square, but he's almost never there. So yeah, for example, here, if you want to see if the pawn goes to the end, you just see if he can get into the square or not. That's it. So that's the very first concept. If the king is behind the pawn, do you think he will ever catch the pawn? If the pawn gets to move first? No. Because if he's ever behind, even if he's right behind it, the pawn will move, then the king will move. And pretty soon the pawn will make it to the end before the king. So that is how you figure out if you can catch a pawn or not. Now, if it's the pawn's turn to move, then just first move the pawn in your head and then create the square. And then see if the king will make it or not. So let's say this is the situation and it's the pawn's turn. Will the king catch it or not? An easier way to say it is if it's the pawn's turn, the king has to already be in the square. But if it's the king's turn, he can take a move to get in the square. So right now it's the pawn's turn. So is the king inside the square? Yeah, so he will catch it. Right now it's the king's turn. Is the king inside the square? No, but can he get in the square? Yeah, so once again, the king will catch it. Is that clear to everyone? I feel like I didn't explain that well. Yeah? Okay, if anyone has any questions, let me know, because that's the most basic. Now, most of the time, the king will actually be able to make it in time if it's just the pawn and the king racing to the end. So usually, because the king is so close to the pawn, you won't be able to get your pawn to the end just by moving the pawn, because he'll make it. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to use your king to escort the pawn. Your king will help your pawn get to the end. Why can it be so helpful? Because the king can provide a protector to the pawn. So for example, if I move my king here, I can now keep pushing my pawn up for a couple of squares, and he won't be able to eat it because I'll eat him. He won't kill it because I'll kill him. Now, let's look at this situation. Okay. Let's say he's in front like this, and I'm here. Okay. If you have a king and a pawn, and you're trying to get it to the end, you can never let your pawn be in front of your king. I'll explain to you later why that is, but the basic reason is because black has a strategy to make it a draw. So don't ever move your pawn in front of your king, not even side by side. Your pawn has to always be behind your king until the very end. So here, do you think this would be a good move? No, because you don't want your pawn and king side by side. Do you think this would be a good move? Yeah, it's not bad because your king is still below. Okay, great. Now, the way you get your pawn to the end, when there's a king and a pawn and another king, and you want to escort that pawn to the end, is you want to stay on the opposite side of his king. So look, let's start actually earlier like this. Let's say it's like this. If he goes to the left, do you think it's smart for you to go to the left or go to the right? Which square do you think is the best place for you to go? Just take a guess. Not too important. Just take a guess. So let's say we go to d6. Well, in that case, he will just move to the right, and then I will have to move to the right as well. So if he goes to the left, moving to the left does nothing. Okay. What if he moves to the right? Sorry, what if he moves to the left and we move to the right? Well, once again, he can move back into the center square and we can move back here. And that did nothing, right? We can't just keep moving back and forth forever. So is there any way for us, once he moves to the left, to stop him from going into this square? We need to stop him from going here, because every time we've been going somewhere, he keeps coming back there.
You can move your king to f7.
Yeah, so if he goes to the left and I go to f7, he can't go in this square anymore. And what's even more important is my king here actually can protect all three of these squares. So my pawn can easily just go to each one of those squares and get to the end. So this is how it will go. He'll move to the left. I'll move here to f7. And then he'll just make a move and I'll come up. And boom, I win the game. Okay. Okay. This is the same thing you have to do regardless of where everything else is. So even if you guys are a step back, if he goes to the left, you go to the right, up and to the right. And then if he goes to the center, you want to follow him. You want to also go to the center. So kind of try and copy him and keep pushing him back. So here, if he goes here, you can go to the right and up. Then if he goes to the center, what do you think you should do?
Go to the center.
Yeah. So the overall strategy is every time he leaves the center to go somewhere, like let's say he goes here, you want to move up and on the opposite side of him. So if he went left, move up and to the right. If he went right, move up and to the left. Not that hard. And every time he goes into the center, you also want to copy him and go into the center, regardless of where you are. And that's the strategy. Now let's see how it works in practice. So for it to work, first you need your king to be 2 squares ahead of your pawn. So you see right now he's 2 squares ahead. Great. Now let's say black moves. Where should I move?
To F5.
Yeah, he moved left, so I'm going to move up and to the right. Great. He moves up here, let's say. Then I can move to the center. Okay? He moves left, I move up. Now, this is not always true because he can move down, but let's say for now he doesn't. I'll tell you what to do when he moves down. But he can move up, we can move here. And now you see we've pushed him all the way to the end and we're here. Once we've pushed him to the end, we need to start getting this pawn there because we can't just keep moving around our king all the time. So now we can just ignore his king for a bit until he comes back to the center. And now we're in the same position we were before. So I'm going to push my pawn. And let's say he moves to the left. Where do I move?
To F7.
F7. Now I'm protecting these squares. So once he moves here, what do I do?
You can move your pawn up.
Yeah, now that I'm protecting these squares, everything else I can just move my pawn up. Easy peasy. Okay. Now, that's how you essentially win. He'll just keep moving to the center and you just move to the opposite side until you get to the end and then move your pawn up like this. And now he's in the center and then you know what to do from here. Now, sometimes he will try and trick you by making a bad move on purpose. So he will move here and then you will move to the, he will move here and you'll move to the right. And he will move down like this. Now, this is never good for black. So the only reason he does this is so that he can trick you. If he ever moves down, his king and your king are both protecting these same squares. So what you can actually do now is just push your pawn up. So if his king is not ahead of your king, if your kings are side to side, just push the pawn up. And as long as it's not, yeah, and then you're good. It'll be check and he'll move up. And now he's attacking these squares. Now, let's go a little bit here. Okay. Let's see if you guys can win this game without any advice from me anymore. Okay. So I'm going to move my pawn up. He's in check and he goes up here. Now, how do you think you should move your pawn all the way to the end here? What do you think you should do? Because right now, if I move my pawn up, he'll come to this square and then I won't be able to go there. So I need to make sure that his king can't go to this square.
Move your king to F7 first.
And now what do I do? Now that I've protected all 3 squares.
And then you can move your pawn all the way up to the end.
Yeah. So the lesson here is if his king and your king are just facing each other, try and keep them facing each other. So if he goes up, you go up. and then you'll be good. If he goes up again, you can go up again. If he goes down, you go down. But don't do that too much because it'll just be a repetition. But eventually, you can just keep moving the pawn up. And as long as the pawn is beneath the king, then you'll win the game. If you ever move the pawn to the side of the king, you won't win anymore. It'll be a draw. So just be careful. You can move the pawn up as much as you want, as long as he's below the king. Okay, so let me try. I'll play black and you guys play white. Okay, so you're that side and I'm this side. And I'm going to make a move and then you're supposed to make a move and try and get your pawn all the way to the end. Okay, so I'll make this move. What should you do? Here, I'll flip it so it's easier for you guys. So I made this move.
Move the king to f5.
Yeah, f5, up and to the right. Great. I'm going to make this move.
Move your king to e5.
Now I'm going to make this move.
Move your king to d6.
Yep. And now I'm going to try and trick you. I'm going to move here.
Move your pawn up.
Okay. Now I'm going to move up.
Move your king up to d7.
Move down.
Move your king down to d6.
Yeah, and now we're starting to repeat. So don't let me repeat. So I went up again. You don't want to move up again.
Move your pawn to e5.
Yep. And now I'm going to go in.
Move your king to e6.
Here.
Move your king to f7.
Good job. And now you can just push your pawn up all the way. So good job. See, you just won a game entirely without any of my help. So now you know how to win if you have a pawn and a king, and your king is 2 squares above the pawn. It doesn't need to be 2. It needs to be at least 2 though, like 2 or more. So great. Now, let me show you. Okay, so that's how you win if you have that. Now, the reason that all these rules I've said is because if you don't follow the rules, black will be able to draw the game. So let me show you a situation where your pawn is beside your king. And let me show you how black can draw the game. You guys should pay attention to this because if you're ever black and your opponent does this, this is how you draw the game. So let's say it's your turn. What you want to do is you just want to copy him. So you see right now his king is on the left side. Just go on the left side. If his king goes back, you can come up. If his king goes right, you can just copy him. And now, eventually, you guys will get all the way down to here. Okay? Now, like this, sorry. Wait, did I do it right? Okay, there. So let's say this is the situation and he goes here, okay? He will eventually come here. And when he comes here, you want to be here. So remember back here when I said, oh, you have to copy him. So if he goes to the left, you go to the left. You have to keep that up. So you have to create a situation where if he's ever going to this square, you want to also go to this square. And if he ever goes to this square, you want to go to this square. So if he goes here and you immediately go to that square, then once he's there, you'll be out of that square. And that's not good. So if he ever goes here, you don't want to go to that square. You want to save that for when he comes here. Instead, what other square can you go to?
You can go to e7.
Yeah, you can go to e7. And now if he comes here, you just take that square again. On the other hand, if he goes back to the right, then you can just go up. So Yeah, if he goes to the right, you go down. If he goes left, you go up. And you see, you keep going up and down, up, until he eventually comes here and he's like, no, I'm not going to let you go up and down anymore. What do you do when he comes here?
You go to F7.
Yeah, you follow him. And now he goes here and you go here. And this is the important one. You want to go back down here. It's the same thing as when you were up here, right? Whenever he was here, you want it to be here so that when he comes here, you come here. The same thing happens. So when he checks you, if you go here right away, he will come here. You don't want that. Instead, you want to go down in the middle. And now when he comes here, you can follow him. What happens if he doesn't go there? What if he comes here?
Then you can move up to E7.
Yeah. So once again, we have that bup happening until eventually he'll be like, no more bup. And you can just follow him. And then he will push the pawn. Eventually he'll push the pawn and you'll be in check. And well, if you go to the left, he'll promote. So the only move you have left is to go to the right. And his only move is to go here. If he goes like here, you'll just take the pawn. So he'll come here. And this situation is, well, you're not in check and you can't actually go anywhere because he'll take you. So this is actually a draw. So you have actually successfully drawn with black. And that's why it's so bad to have the king and pawn next to each other, because the black can do this whole bup strategy and then just win. Or no, not win, but draw. So same thing as before. See if you guys can draw against me in this situation. So I'm gonna make, oh yeah, you're the first to move. So go ahead and try and draw against me.
Move the king to F5.
Okay. What about here?
Move your king to E4.
Okay. What about here?
Move your king to D5.
D5?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I come to D5, he'll move down to E5, sorry, to D3. Now you guys are facing each other and you have to move away. What you want to do is you want to move down here so that if he ever comes to D3, you can follow him. Yeah, so let's try it again. Let's say, okay, your turn.
Move the king to D5.
D5, he moves back.
Move the king to E4.
E4, he goes right.
Move the king to E5.
Well done, yeah, E5. And then if he comes to D3, you go to D5. And this will just happen on and on again. So he'll check you. Where do you go if he checks you?
You go to E5. I mean E6.
Wonderful. E6 is the right move. Because if you go to E5, then once he does this, you're not in the same position as before, right? You want to be E6, just like you said. So when he comes here, you go here. Yeah. And this will just happen on and on again. So bup, and then he'll be like, no. And you follow him, check, and now where do you go?
E7.
E7. He goes here, up, here, down, here, up. You see, all of this is just drawn. He comes here. Where do you go?
To E.
E?
E.
So he went right.
D7.
D7. Well done. And he comes here. Where do you go?
To E8.
E8. He comes here. Where do you
go? To D8.
Well done. He checks you.
And then to E8 again.
Yeah, and then he comes here and it's a draw game. So that you have just finished the basics of pawn and king endgame. You have learned how to draw if you're down a pawn, you've learned how to win if you're up a pawn, and you've learned how to move your pawn to the end, how to know whether or not he will catch you. So that is pawn and king endgame. Now, this is really, really difficult for beginners to fully understand just because there's so many steps. So I recommend you guys just watch this over and over until you actually get a hang of it. Because not only is it difficult, but it comes up in every game you'll play, almost every game you'll play. Most games are either won or lost based on these. So learn these well. Okay. So that is all I really wanted to say for endgames, at least for now. Wait, I want to say one more thing. Okay. So when the pawn goes to the end, we can turn it into these 4 pieces. Okay. Now there are times where each of these 4 pieces is the best thing to turn it to. Sometimes it's better to move it to turn it into a knight. Sometimes it's best to turn it into a bishop, sometimes rook, and sometimes queen. Most of the times, as you guys probably guess, it's queen. Almost every time it's queen. But there are some times when queen is actually bad to turn it to. Maybe another piece would be much better. I'll give you an example. Okay. This is the example I usually use. Okay. Actually, just to make it a little easier. Okay. There we go. So let's say right now it's white's turn. Okay. Now imagine it was black's turn. Is the king in check right now? No. Can this pawn move? No. Can this knight move? So some people say yes. What happens if the knight moves?
The king will be in check.
Yeah, and the king is not allowed to be in danger. So the knight cannot move. Okay, can this knight move? Yeah, he can move here, he can move here, he can move here. Okay, so the only piece of blacks that can move is this knight. So we have to make sure that that knight can still move, because if that knight can ever not move, then black will be in a draw because of stalemate. So if I push this pawn and I create a queen, can that knight move anymore? No, because what happens when I move the knight, for example?
The king will be in check.
Yeah, and that's not allowed. So you see now when I've made a queen, all 3 of these pieces are locked into position. And if your king is not in check and you can't move any of your pieces, it's a stalemate. So unfortunately, even though I was winning by a whole queen and I had a rook and he didn't, and I had a queen and he didn't, me making a new queen actually ended up being bad for me because I don't want to draw, I want to win. Same thing would happen if I made a rook, by the way. The rook is also bad in this situation because it'd still be in check. So in this situation, if you want to promote, maybe promote it to a bishop, maybe promote it to a knight. It's your choice, but don't promote it to a queen or a rook. So I just like to put in that situation just because people are like, oh, why are we ever even allowed to change it to another piece? We'll always just change it to a queen. But no, sometimes it's just bad to change it to a queen. And a lot of people actually use that against you. So sometimes people will be losing like this. Like sometimes a person will be in this situation like this. and let's say they're black, and they intentionally put their king on this square so that when you create a queen, his king will have nowhere to go to. And now he just loses the game. Sorry, he just draws the game. If instead, when you push this pawn, you made a rook, his king could still go to this square. You see, a queen blocks that square, but a rook doesn't. So it's best to turn it to a rook, and then his king goes here, and then you can checkmate him. So does that make sense? Usually you turn it into a queen. And if you have no time to think about it, just turn it into a queen because it's probably the best move. But there are rare cases where just don't do it. Don't turn it into a queen. Okay. Now that we're done, no, we're not done the end game, but that's enough for today in terms of end game. I want to teach you one thing that is most often used in the mid game, and it's called the pin. Now, most of you already have seen the pin a bajillion times because I always talk about it, but I've never really called it a pin until now. Okay, so can this knight move anywhere? No. Why can't this knight move here?
Otherwise, the king will be in check.
Yeah. So what we actually say is that this knight is pinned to the king. So what that means is this knight cannot move, otherwise you lose a king. So the knight is pinned. You can actually be pinned to other things too. So being pinned to a king is really strong because you're not ever allowed to move the knight. But you can also be pinned to something weaker, like a queen. You see, now he's pinned to a queen. So if he ever moves the knight, he's allowed to move the knight now. But if he ever does, he loses a queen. So that's what a pin is. A pin is when you have a piece. If you have an attacker that's attacking a piece and then a more powerful piece that's behind it. So if there's an attacker that's pinning one weak piece to a more powerful piece. You can pin with not pretty much anything. You can pin with a bishop, a rook, or a queen. So for example, this is a pin with a rook. You see, once again, the knight cannot move because the queen will die. Like this, right? You can pin with a queen too, like this. Or like this. You can't pin with a knight. Knight has its own special abilities, but you can't pin with a knight. Now, there are a number of ways to get out of a pin. Let's see if you guys can come up with a few of them. So I'll give you guys the pieces to, okay. So there are 3 ways to get out of a pin in this situation. Can you guys think of what they are? What might a couple of the ways be?
You can use your
Hold on.
knight to capture the queen.
Yeah, you can use the knight to capture the queen. So if the thing that's attacking the 2 is dead, then he won't pin. That one's pretty obvious. Okay, can you think of another one? To stop this attack? Actually, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
You can move your bishop to c7.
Yeah. So this is interception. So now the queen is not pinning the knight to the king, it's pinning the knight to the bishop. But for it to be a pin, the 2 have to, like, for example, the bishop and the knight are worth the same piece, same worth. So you're not actually pinning a weak piece to a strong piece. You're pinning them to themselves. So it's not actually a pin anymore. This is the most common way people stop pins. Now, the next one, you could have also done the knight here, which is the same thing as the bishop. And another thing you could do is you could just move the king. You could move the more powerful piece away, and now he's not pinned. Be careful when you do that because you still need to protect the knight somehow. So right now, if I move it, he'll just kill the knight. But if the king was here, for example, and I moved it, then he can't kill the knight because I'm still protecting it. So that's how you get rid of pins. Now, let me just show you one situation where people actually use pins. This is the most often place you'll see a pin. So see if you guys can spot it. Okay, tell me when there's a pin on the board. Tell me just to stop. You guys see it yet? Is it there yet? Okay, where is it? Where is this pin?
It's the bishop pinning the knight to the king.
Yeah, there you go. The bishop pinning this knight to the king. And that's one of the earliest pins you'll ever see. And usually the best way to stop it is to put your own bishop in front of it. And now there's no pin. There's no longer any pin. So that's what a pin is. Now, this pin in particular is pretty bad because if you don't get in the way right away, he will actually just take the knight. So this ends the pin. But now, if you look at it, your pawns are behind each other. And you never want your pawns to be back to back like that. This is called the double pawns. So if you have double pawns, that's bad. It's almost like, because the reason it's bad is because they, like the head of one of them goes into the butt of the other one. Like for one of them to move, the other one has to first move. So it's almost like you have only one pawn. You see, you can't move one of them at a time. You have to move them one at a time. Like they have to take turns. So it's much weaker than if they were separate. And so in this situation, when he does this, and he takes it, black is losing now because he has two pawns that are back to back. That's bad. And you never want that to happen. So if someone pins your knight, so let's say it's like, this. If someone pins your knight, block it so that he doesn't need to do the double pawns. Now, if he takes it, you can just take it and there's no double pawns. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Because I think I covered way too much in this class. Does anyone have any questions?